Tonight, I have the great pleasure of bringing you the criminal defense lawyer, Robert Knightley, for his third interview. This is part 3 of 3. He's not going away. We'll then be delving into his individual memoirs and stories. But for tonight, we are covering the third chapter of his life, where he left New York and moved to Albany. Just for a quick recap, for those of you that haven't been following, Robert Knightley is a man of 3 converging paths. He's a former police officer, a practicing criminal attorney, an accomplished author, and tonight we experience how these 3 paths have woven a life of intrigue and compassion. I'm Carrie Bean. I'm the host of AITQR, which is a community theatre group based in New York City. So, good evening, Robert.
Good evening, Carrie, and everyone. You mentioned, you suggested I talk about why I left New York City, why we left New York City, my wife, Rose, and I. Well, in 2008, I had been a legal aid society criminal defense lawyer for the past 18 years. At the time, I was based in Queens County Criminal Courts. I had started in the Manhattan Criminal Courts, 5 years there, 13 years in Queens. I was ready to slow down. I was, I suppose, looking for a semi-retirement. And also, I was convinced that nobody wants to grow old in New York City. It's a great place for the young and acceptable for middle age, but if you're old, go find a slower place, kinder place, which I found Albany to be when I went there. Out of curiosity, I wasn't really too aware of what existed north or west of New York City, where I was born and then spent my entire life. So I made Albany the first stop, and I liked it. We liked it. It was full of neighborhoods that remind me of growing up in Brooklyn in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So in 2008, we moved there. We looked for a place to live, found a 3-story townhouse that looked like something from Park Slope, downtown Brooklyn, that would go for about $1 million at least. It went for 250 grand, which struck me as incredible. And so we bought it and didn't regret a thing. It was lovely. You could walk on the first floor all the way through the house to a garden in the back, which was quite kind of living we was looking for at the time. We were there 7 years till it began to dawn on me, especially that 2 flights of stairs to get up to the second and third stories was getting a little challenging for us as we got older. We looked around and found a single level ranch house in another Albany neighborhood around a pond with a fancy name, the Buckingham Pond area. Nice neighborhood, no regrets, and we've been there for 5 years now, and no plans to leave Albany for anywhere else.
And can I just say that I believe that your close friends and neighbors in New York in 2008 considered that when you were leaving New York, you were literally moving to foreign soil, correct?
Yeah, correct. They couldn't believe that anybody would leave New York City to go to Albany. They called it a pigsty of corruption. They were people who had no really experience of corruption. You can't beat New York City for corruption. The difference between New York City and Albany is extent. And in New York City, they do it behind closed doors. In Albany, they do it right in your face. Uh, but it's certainly a nice place to live. Uh, at the moment, it's going through some violence in the streets, which needs some addressing by the local police who need a little help on what to do next. I'm thinking about maybe I'll give them a hand.
Okay, I'm just jumping in here. Robert's 80. Now, he's going to be 80 in a couple of months. So he won't be jumping. He might be standing there and brandishing a book at them or yelling at them, but he can't be jumping because he's nearly 80. Robert,
I thought I'd just write him an op-ed, that's all.
yeah, an op-ed would be good. And also, you know, it's interesting. There was a comment earlier on today in one of our discussions where I came away from it that you had implied that forgery, for example, in Albany could be seen as a misdemeanor, and gave me an amazing example of how the Albany courts actually are capable of showing kindness and heart. And you are relatively well known in Queens, in the Bangladeshi community, as the man to go to. So apparently there's been quite a few immigrants who have come to you, to come all the way from New York to Albany just to have you help them and guide them through the system. And I'd love you to talk to me a little bit about, there's been a couple of cases. One of them was a gentleman that was accused of forgery, and it was then seen as a misdemeanor, and what happened to him. And then another gentleman that was actually, he was confronted by ICE and you directly, immigration police directly outside the courts when you two came out, standing by the trunk of your court. So please take it away, because these were very moving, compelling stories today that we were talking about.
Well, as you mentioned, early on up here, I handled a case of an immigrant from Queens. And they're usually from a community like the Bangladeshis in Jackson Heights, Queens. And his problem was this: he was a driver for a living. When he came here, first settled here from his country, the only work he could possibly get was as a driver, driving. And he needed a legal license for that. And what they often did, since they had no identification sufficient to get a driver's license, they borrowed something from a friend, including his name. And they got themselves a license to drive and make a living. After they got established and were doing okay, and for a number of years, they wanted to get that license in their own true name, and they applied for it to DMV. The application for a replacement license has a question there: have you ever had a license under another name? And they typically answer no, and that's considered under the law as when you sign your name under oath, forgery, filing a false instrument. So they get a letter from the DMV, the New York State DMV, saying your driving privileges are suspended and you will get a new replacement license to you. Call us up and we want to talk to you. So at that point, they come to me. And I had success with the early cases. I discovered, and they discovered, these Bangladeshi drivers, that in Albany, you could walk away without getting a criminal conviction. At the end of the case, you wouldn't be saddled with a criminal conviction, which would be hard to explain to immigration when you're trying to get a green card or to move beyond the green card that you had. In Albany, I would deal with the motor vehicle department. We'd arrange for a surrender. The person would come up, I'd meet them, take them to the Department of Motor Vehicles, surrender them to a DMV investigator. He'd take them and process them, fingerprint them, photograph them, and then bring them to the Albany City Criminal Court, where I'd be waiting for. As soon as I got there, the Albany District Attorney's Office would draft a complaint for a forgery felony, filing a forged instrument. And they'd come out to the courtroom in front of the judge with me, and they plead. They wouldn't plead anything yet. The charge would be an E felony, forgery. The district attorney's office would almost immediately reduce the felony to a misdemeanor charge and offer a plea to disorderly conduct to dispose of the case, which is just fine. Disorderly conduct is not a crime. It doesn't have any effect on your immigration status. You pay a fine of $700 and you walk out of court with your green card or future green card intact. And so Albany became the place to come if you got one of those letters from DMV. And among New York City lawyers, I became their man in Albany. and it went like that. Now, any other place in the state, including anywhere in New York City, you couldn't walk away from a charge like that without a criminal plea, without a plea to a misdemeanor, which would not have a good effect on your immigration, your future as a lawful permanent resident. So this one case I had was with a Bangladeshi man from Jackson Heights. And we went through that process, and he was, he came out with me. I had his personal belongings in the trunk of my car. So we left the criminal court right outside the court. And as I was about to give him his possessions, ICE showed up. They had been waiting outside the court, and they arrested him on the spot. Told him that he was being taken into custody for immigration violations. Now he has a immigration lawyer in New York City who was working on getting him his permanent status, permanent legal status. All I could do for him was to tell ICE to don't question him and tell me where he's going. They didn't tell me where he was going, but I could figure it out. He was going into custody. And I later found out that what happens is eventually he's taken to Batavia outside Buffalo, New York, where the immigration jail. Now, there are only two immigration courts in New York State, one in Batavia, Batavia near Buffalo, and the other in New York City. There's nothing in between. So they took him there. And I was in contact with his immigration lawyer in the city, and I helped him with whatever I could help him with. And that was that, I thought. 21 months later, I got a telephone call. And it was he. He told me that he had just been released from immigration jail in Batavia, where he'd spent 21 months in custody. And he has a wife and a child in Brooklyn, where he was living. I've been in touch with them, had sent his belongings on to them, and he was a success story. He was on his, he was about to get permanent residence in the U.S., but it took 21 months in custody for that to happen. Why that should be the case, I'm sure there is no good reason on earth why it should happen like that. But that's his story, and it's a happy ending for him.
There's not so many happy endings.
Not so many. So many. Yeah, not so long. Last year there was the ICE, the immigration was sending detainees, housing detainees in jails all over. They sent 200 immigration detainees taken into custody on the southern border up to the Albany County Jail to be lodged until they could appear in the Batavia court in Buffalo on their cases, which meant there were many months in the Albany County Jail. The local immigration lawyers rounded up volunteers to interview these poor souls in the Albany jail to get backgrounds on their cases. so they could defend them in the immigration courts. I interviewed a half dozen in the Albany County Jail. 4 women, 2 men. Really, I was just getting their personal stories, their background, how they got where they got. What was uniform was the fact that they had started in places like Honduras, Nicaragua. They had left to save their lives, the lives of their children. The male children were recruited by gangs, and you didn't have the option of refusing. It wouldn't be worth your life to refuse. So these people ran with their families, and they ran through several countries. They might start in Honduras and Nicaragua, Colombia, and they'd go on. They'd end up going through Central America, South America, till they get to the southern border of the U.S., and there be taken into custody by ICE after that harrowing, terrible trip. And the U.S. is not, this administration is not kind to immigrants and these people who go through hell to get here. And their stories certainly tell that. And so I feel for them, and I will always do what I can to help them.
Thank you, Robert. It really is an honor tonight to be able to have this first-hand account of what you experienced in an area that we only can read about mostly or experience through documentary film. There's a rare occasion for us to actually live it in the courts and really understand from the legal perspective how these people are being processed and handled. It's a sad and shocking state of affairs. And you know that the work that we do with our immigration theatre group is very much leans towards this direction of supporting and sustaining and telling the story of the immigrant. The other side of Robert that before we jump over to his crime novels that I would like to just bring up now, because he has such an all-round compassionate hard ass, is he was awarded by the Domestic Violence Project of the Capital District Women's Bar Association an award called the Stanley P. Rosen Memorial in 2013. And the plaque says that Robert had demonstrated an ability to litigate matters on behalf of victims of domestic violence while showing the utmost professionalism and integrity in dealing with the court, litigants, and attorneys, qualities exemplified by Stanley Rosen during his lifetime. This must have been quite a moment for you to receive this award.
It was indeed. It was a complete surprise to me. I'd never gotten a plaque before from anybody. When I first got up here, I had never been in a family court in the city. I was strictly criminal courts. When I got up here, I thought I'd volunteer for the Domestic Violence Project of the Women's Albany County Women's Bar Association. Since I dealt with enough abused women and their abusers as a policeman in New York City, I could relate to that kind of work and thought it was well worth doing. And I found that to be the case when I got into family court. I enjoyed poking their abusers, and probably the first time in these women's lives they saw somebody who abused their abusers, as I happily did.
Wow, that's amazing.
I'd call them liars. I'd see if I could provoke them to show their true selves in front of a judge. Mm-hmm. And it amused me no end when I'd succeed. And I swear it amused the judges when I succeeded too. Since most of the judges, it seems, in family courts are women, these clowns, these morons would would talk to the judge, the family court judge, like they were talking to their women, to their wives. And in family court, there is the only recourse a judge would have would be to hold them in contempt, which is an awkward way to try to keep order in a courtroom. Can't hold everybody in contempt. And this sort of thing was new to me because it never happens in a criminal court. You see, if anybody acts up in a criminal court, the police court officers simply drag him in the back to the pens behind the court and adjust his attitudes before they bring him out again in a very chastened attitude. That doesn't happen in family court. These clowns get away with quite a bit. So I felt that there was definitely a place for me in family court.
And just to understand this, your first family court entrance was in Albany. You didn't do this in New York.
That's right, I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't. I've become kind of well versed in family court practice since I've been doing quite a lot of not just domestic violence cases, but custody and support cases, and it's a lot more streamlined, simpler than criminal cases.
And with the general psychology of this, would you say that the formative years in the police force when you were a rookie cop, was there anything during that time that you learned on the beat that also helped with how you handled this, or does this come from your experience in criminal psychology over your years as being a criminal lawyer? That you're able to get inside the head of some of these thugs and abusers?
Well, I learned what I know from first being a cop. I learned to listen, to kind of get to what the real facts are and what's ever happening, and only make decisions based on that, and also to keep my own reactions under control and out of the picture. I'm there only as a help to the victim, not as the punisher of the guilty. And that's what I learned being a cop, and that's the fact that that's what you learn to be as a criminal defense lawyer, if you're going to be effective.
Well, and we're segueing here because I love doing this. Your fictional NYPD cop, Harry Corbin. Is that right? Harry Corbini or Harry Corbin?
Corbin. Detective Harry Corbin.
Detective Harry Corbin, in your novels, Bodies in Winter and The Cold Room, is described by his colleagues as unorthodox, unethical, and unreliable. And I find that highly charming. That these are the epithets bestowed on Harry Corbin by his colleagues.
Well,
yeah.
Oh, that's true. But Harry is one thing they didn't say. He's very effective.
Right. So we're taking another twist here because I would like us to come back to Albany. We've left the courts for a minute and we've moved into your writing rooms because Robert Knightley is a mystery writer, criminal crime and mystery writer. He's written not only several novels, he has had many short stories published. He's also edited anthologies of short stories, and he has written film scripts for Hollywood. So Robert is an extremely well-versed author, and he comes from a very early journalistic background where he was actually training as a journalist in his army days, way back. So he has decades of experience, and this shows in his crime writing, which has been lauded as being particularly clever, very clever. Robert is a very clever writer, but he appeals to the everyman. It's not intellectual hot-potch where you really want to put the book down halfway through it. So Robert, let's have a look at Bodies in Winter. Could you hold that up for us?
Yep.
All right, and I'm just going to pin you so that we get a nice close look. A little bit, that's it. Bodies in Winter, Robert Knightley. This was published by Seven Publishing House in London, which is a very reputable publishing house for crime and mystery. And I would like to hear about the New York cop, David Lodge, who's a drunk. And Robert, just let's talk a little bit about how this came to be a mafia-style killing and where you got your material from.
Well, this book was 20 years in the writing, first novel. Now, it was based on what the inciting incident for me was the case of the sodomy of Abner Louima in a New York City police station, the 70th precinct. It was the end of the 90s, or perhaps it was the end of the 80s, but it was a famous case. And it was a New York City policeman, Robert Volpe, sodomized Abner Louima in the bathroom of the 72nd Precinct Station House after he was brought in with a number of other Haitians arrested. The fact of his Haitian nationality had something to do with his abuse. And it became a very famous case. What happened was the press blew the whistle on the case while it was going on, and the federal prosecutors got involved in the case, and they prosecuted Robert Volpe, and eventually he pled guilty in federal court, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But the part of the case that intrigued me was what happened to the other cops who worked with Volpe at the time, who were involved in the apprehension of Louima. Louima said there was somebody who stood watch outside the bathroom, on the threshold of the bathroom, while what was happening to him was going on. And and I don't know if he identified this policeman, Charles Schwartz, a famous name in the case, Charles Schwartz, or if the federal prosecutors decided that it was Schwartz. Schwartz absolutely denied that he was near there at all. But he went to trial as well, and he beat that charge. But ultimately, he was found guilty of perjury, and he did 5 years in prison. Now, what really is intriguing about this case is what can happen to anybody, even a policeman, if you're in the grip of a ambition-driven prosecution without soul or without concern about guilt or innocence. This was a media case, and they had determined who was guilty, and they were going to prove it at all costs. What intrigued me about it was there were two policemen unrelated to this whole business who were from another command, and they were processing an arrest in the 72nd precinct at the time this was going on. And they told the federal prosecutor that they hadn't seen anything. They didn't know what was going on, and he didn't believe them. And he managed to get them convicted of perjury. And one of them went to jail. One of them refused to, one of them pled guilty out of fear, and one of them would not. Eventually, those convictions were reversed by the appellate court. But that, in a larger sense, anytime there's a bad cop like Volpe, who is still in prison serving his sentence, he always takes down his brother officers who ever work with him. They don't have to actually do anything much, but if they're around him, and particularly if they try to cover up what he did, they're going to lose. They're going to lose certainly their jobs, their pensions, and quite possibly their freedom. That's a theme that I find intriguing always. How a bad a bad apple, as they say, can take down a lot of good apples all around them, you know.
And does a cop ever survive in prison?
They kept out of the general population. They're kept in protective custody, in effect. Yeah. They wouldn't last in general, except I know one who did. That's another story.
Oh, we'll go there. We'll go there.
That was another one.
For anybody that's wondering how we're doing this, we are midway through our interview 3 of 3 with Robert Knightley, and then we are actually going to deep dive into his memoirs and stories over the next few months. So you're not going to lose him. We just decided to do this first series based on his journalism, his time as a cop, his time as a legal aid defense lawyer in Queens and Manhattan, and then the move to Albany, his time here as a criminal defense lawyer, a great supporter of immigrants, and also a heavily published author. So that's what these 3 have been about. So Robert, that to you, I just wanted to refresh that for anybody else that had just joined us. But please continue with Bodies of Winter before we get to the cold room.
Well, Charles Schwartz was really the character I wanted to function on. He became David Lodge in the book. Now, he doesn't make any appearance except in flashback, because as the book begins, he's dead. He's been on the second or third day, he's out of prison. He went to prison for having killed a prisoner in the precinct cells that he'd arrested. So they claimed that since he was a drunk and I couldn't remember anything, he was in a blackout, and all he could say is, "I don't remember doing any such thing." However, he pled guilty. Actually, he was railroaded by his fellow cops and by the system, and he did 7 years in state prison. And on the second or third day out, he was killed on a Queen Street. That's the beginning of the novel, as Detective Harry Corbin and his partner, Adele Bentibi, a woman, his new partner. And this book is also about the blue wall of silence, as they call it, and very cruel fraternity that exists in the police department that doesn't include women. And if you want to succeed in the police department, NYPD, you have to be more masculine than the men to get by. But Adele is not like that at all. She's outspoken. She's smart, and she won't be bamboozled by anyone. For that reason, she's roundly disliked by her fellow cops in the prison.
She's our kind of woman. We love her.
Exactly.
Damn.
and Harry's crisis is this: Detective Harry Corbin is liked by everybody. He's everybody's friend. Harry goes along to get along. Now, when is he going to keep going along and getting along, or is he gonna stand by his partner Adele, who becomes his lover later on? Actually,
don't give it all away.
Well,
you can't tell a whole story now.
That's inevitable. I won't tell you what happens.
Okay, so everybody, that's Bodies in Winter. Now we know that these bodies co-join. They're not just dead bodies. There's also some bodies getting together. And the cold room?
The cold room is...
can you hold that up for us, please, Robert?
Yeah, sure. The cold room.
Okay, here we go. The cold room.
The
Great
cold
cover.
room is about domestic slavery. It was provoked by a news story I read in New York City. A domestic maid in Manhattan. She works for a family, a diplomatic family, a Saudi family in Manhattan, and she jumps out a window to escape. since she's virtually a slave. They keep her in custody, in effect, and and the whole story comes to light. And it's not an infrequent story, I gather. What happens is some kind of a slave organization. In this case, it's a Russian gang led by a Chechen named Aslan Khalid. And the way the book starts is Detective Corbin has to investigate the eviscerated body of a young woman, an immigrant, found abandoned under the Williamsburg Bridge in Brooklyn. And from there, he refuses to write off the case, close the case as an unidentified DOA. Instead, he investigates and he finds out who she is. So this is a travelogue through the immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, which fascinate me. And we come to meet a Catholic priest and a nun at a women's shelter in Maspeth, Queens, who become main players in the novel, and which involves the seal of confession for one thing, and the nun becomes Harry Corbin's right hand helper, actually.
The nun does.
The nun does.
Oh.
The nun does, and in the end, well.
Oh, we don't know.
I won't tell you the end.
No, you're not allowed to tell us the end. So, as you can see, you are experiencing so many facets, and you're able to put these in literature for us to read. And we now know, or I've known, but the viewers are learning also that this first-hand experience that you have as to how the system works or doesn't work. And these are real stories that we all understand that you take a fictional stab at it, but it comes basically from your years and years and years of seeing this firsthand.
I wouldn't say it doesn't work, but sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I'm too quick off the mark sometimes.
But the one thing about writing a novel is that a crime novel is that the background, the context, the place where things happen are as important as any character in the book or any story. Readers want to go to a new place, and you have to bring it alive for them, so they want to stay there and come back.
And you do it most successfully. And I would ask you to just hold both books up again one more time. Hold them both up for us. We're going to pin him. So make sure to read these. Everybody out there, they're fabulous. Make sure to read them. He's a very, very compelling writer. Thank you, Robert. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our third interview with Robert Knightley. He's brought us to Albany. We've experienced what he's living through right now. He will be celebrating his 80th birthday in November. And prior to that, we're going to be doing a series of short, in-depth interviews where he talks about each of his short stories, and he's then going to read the stories for us. So watch out for this, because they'll just be coming out in bursts on our AITQR platform, and then we'll be putting them on YouTube and also creating a YouTube for all of Robert's material. Right now, he's just sitting on mine, which looks a little weird, but we are going to get Robert's own YouTube channel up and running and get all of these interviews up there so that we have a lovely archive of your story reading, which we're going to be recording over the next few months, Robert, which I can't wait. I think it's going to be wonderful to have you reading these firsthand.
Thank you all. Nice,
so, my pleasure, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you. So it's good night from Robert Knightley and myself. I'm Carrie Bean, and this is the AITQR, which is a community theatre group in New York City, and Robert is our script consultant. So he's also our big boss.
Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you, Robert. Bye-bye.